The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Welcome to the Endurance Experience Podcast. This is Tony Rich. All right, I got a number of positive responses from our last podcast on the Caster Semenya appeal rejection. There were some developments since the podcast, as you may already know. I think both developments are positive. First, after being barred from racing the 800, Caster Semenya signed up to run the 3,000 meters at the Prefontaine Classic on June 30th. This will be interesting to see how she fares in this event. The 800 and the 3,000 meters require different training approaches, so it will be interesting to see how she does. Also, after filing an appeal in the Swiss court, she was cleared to race the 800, at least temporarily, as they sort out the situation. And if you listen to the podcast, our last podcast, I foresaw both of these as possibilities. I think the latter is a great development as well, because it just might force the IAAF to produce or provide more justification for the ruling. She may even win the case. The Court of Arbitration for Sport ruling wasn't unanimous, and the World Medical Association position statement to physicians on the matter is pretty devastating. So she could possibly win or get more time. And I did get a couple of questions and comments on our podcast on male to female trans athletes in sports, albeit we just scratched the surface on that topic on the last podcast. But both topics are ones that we'll have to come back to and do a follow-up podcast on it in forthcoming weeks or months after there's some more information. I'm trying to put something together, and we'll follow up later when I can ensure we get the right people together with the right experiences. So in the interim, if you haven't listened to our last podcast with Dr. Myra, give that a listen. And if you have any comments, definitely send them to contact@eventhorizon.tv. And certainly if there are trans athletes or non-athletes, I definitely like to hear from you, get your perspective, or maybe even have you on the podcast. Okay, let's talk about our topic for today, which is about aging and the endurance athlete. Specifically, we'll be talking about a study published in the European Heart Journal. The study's results, and this study was published at the start of 2019. The study's results showed that endurance sport over other types of exercise, including resistance training, was more beneficial at curbing the effects of aging. So if this is true, this holds particular significance for everyone, really, and the type of exercise of choice, whether you're an athlete or not an athlete. And so I'll read a synopsis of the article. It shouldn't take that long. In the ongoing quest to live forever, some turn to supplements, fad diets, and weird experiments on worms. But perhaps the most well-studied part of anti-aging is the role of telomeres, the protective caps at the end of chromosomes that naturally get shorter as we get older. A new study from Germany suggests that one specific type of exercise may be the key to keeping them long. As we age, telomeres shorten naturally, but there are some things we can do to slow or even, in small part, reverse the process. For the new study in the European Heart Journal, scientists recruited 164 volunteers in Leipzig, Germany, and made them work out. Through this study, co-authored and written by cardiologist Ulrich Lofs, showed that endurance exercise reversed the shortening of telomeres. Strangely, resistance workouts like weightlifting did not. The main finding of this controlled, randomized, supervised 6-month study is that endurance training compared to baseline and to the control group increased telomere activity and telomere length, which both are important for cellular senescence, regenerative capacity, and thus healthy aging, Lofts tells in verse. Participants in the study were separated into 4 groups: a control group, an easy walking running group, an interval training group, and a group that did 45 minutes of lifting. Over 26 weeks, the participants performed their workout of choice 3 times per week. At the end of 6 months, their blood was analyzed for the activity of an enzyme called telomeres, which lengthens the ends of telomeres with DNA building blocks. Telomeres is cell's friend in this case, since once telomere completely depletes, the cell eventually dies. With each division of a cell, the telomere becomes shorter. This is an important molecule and an important mechanism of aging. Once telomeres have reached a critical shortness, the cell undergoes senescence and eventually cell death. In an admittedly small follow-up study, the team narrowed the group down to 15 runners and 10 non-runners to measure the effects of telomeres activity immediately after exercise. They found that 45 minutes of continuous running corresponded with a spike in telomeres activity, but the same could not be said for 45 minutes of lifting. Lofts can't fully explain why telomeres activity spikes with endurance exercise and doesn't in resistance exercise, though he does have an early hypothesis. He explains that endurance exercise, even light ones, causes blood vessels to contract. That, in turn, corresponds with the release of nitric oxide, a molecule that has been shown to increase telomeres activity through the studies, though the studies are still continuous. The differences between endurance and resisting training are likely to be related to the higher rate of laminar vascular shear stress, which regulates the nitric oxide system, he suggests. This concept has been established in experimental animal models that need to be proven in humans. While the study doesn't present quite enough evidence to completely write off resistance exercise for anti-aging, Ulrich adds that the important takeaway is that lifting probably isn't a good replacement for endurance exercise if telomere lengthening is the goal. The good news is, at least you don't have to run hard. If his results hold up, a light jog 3 times a week should suffice. So, is endurance sport the fountain of youth? To discuss this and help me unpack the science here, we'll be talking to Professor Dan Brabander. Dan is a geologist, and his work and research emphasizes transdisciplinary projects that foster collaboration among biologists, chemists, public health scientists, and environmental engineers, and involves research experiences with undergraduates and nonprofit partners. So he's uniquely qualified to discuss this topic. Dan's also primarily a short and long course triathlete and does half marathons as well. And he is soon to crack into the 55-year-old age group. And he is a pretty stellar athlete with podium finishes. So we talk about lifestyle. We talk about training and racing changes that you make as you age up as an endurance enthusiast and breach your 40s and 50s. We talk about how you keep fitness and recovery going in those age ranges. And I tap into Dan's geology knowledge by asking him if rocks or crystals can heal bodies. Spoiler alert, they don't. And so we have a great conversation that is pretty consistent with many of the conversations Dan and I have on many topics. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. Without further delay, I give you Dan Brabander. Professor Dan Brabander, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Tony, it's good to join you today.
All right. So let's start, and if you can describe to our listeners your education background and your career background and how you decided to go into that career.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that's really interesting about career paths is you can plan for a certain trajectory. And then if you're willing to take some risks and imagine a future that's different than you could have imagined when you were younger, you can end up places you could never have dreamed of. And that's what's happened with me. I started as a geology undergraduate and chemistry, doing pretty, if you imagine what a geologist does, I was pretty much that, going out on field trips and rock hammers and trying to pull out from rocks narratives, stories.
Right.
It was the process by which these rocks formed. What can we learn about the Earth as a result of a close investigation of these materials?
Mm-hmm.
And I found it really fun because you could be outside quite a bit, and it also sort of fit with my athletic background.
Right.
In high school, I had run track. At college, I created a club cycling team, which was in which I quickly found out I was better managing the team than actually racing. That might be a different part of the story to talk about. And then I decided, after being unable to get sort of a satisfying job with just an undergraduate degree, plan B was to go to grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And that involved a two-step process. First, getting a master's.
Right.
After that master's, I taught at Salem State College for a year, and I really got the teaching bug. And I realized that in order to really be a professor at a kind of institution that attracts students that really are eager to learn, that I need to go back and get a lot more education. And that's when I decided to go to Brown for my PhD in geosciences.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that point where I started swimming a little bit as a stress relief.
Right.
Although, as you know, Tony, when I first met you, my swimming abilities were quite low.
Right.
But again, I sort of had all three pieces of it. I ran in high school, I biked in college, and I swam mostly as a way of getting out of the lab in graduate school.
Right.
And then I guess the big change I took in my life was I decided to come up to Boston for a postdoc in environmental engineering. Drastically different than what I had done previously, but I really thought that I wanted to do something more applied. something where the work that I was doing might have immediate impact in terms of decision making and reduce people's exposure to toxic materials in the environment. And I was really lucky to have a advisor at MIT who took a massive risk on someone who had the tools, but not the background. And I sort of applied the tools that I had in my toolbox to a drastically different set of questions and went with it. And
Right.
That was a really lucky thing for me. We were living from grant to grant, and I was commuting by bike. So
Right.
during my postdoc years, I didn't exercise much, but I had some commuting by bike that kept me kind of fit.
Right. Kind of. Well, I should show my cards to our listeners in that, as you heard, I know Dan and have been coaching Dan in endurance sports for several years now. So just so I have all my cards on the table here, but I thought of Dan not only because of his scientific background. When this article passed through my feed, when was it, the end of last year, I immediately thought of Dan on this topic of endurance sports potentially minimizing the aging impacts on bodies. And so I thought that Dan would be a good person to talk to, both as a scholar, a someone who has extensive broad scientific background in all of the sciences, that would help us be able to unpack what this what the scientific part of this study has revealed to us. And he's been a pretty substantial competitor in short course triathlon. And I remember when we first started, we gradually got you into doing a couple of long course events. When we first met, he's like, I'm purely a short course triathlete, and we've gotten them gradually, incrementally into some long course events. And so if I had $1 for everyone who said that they would never do a long course event, I'd be a rich guy. But the reason why you're a great person to talk to about this article is because not only because of your scientific background, but also so you'll be turning how old?
54.
And given that you've broken the 50s and still remain so competitive, and I think you're really a perfect example of, or at least potentially, why some of the research here might be telling us something. So let's dive into that. So as you've remained competitive through your 40s and then 50s, what are some things that you do with your family life, and if you can, describe your family life and the dynamic that you have with them, and how you balance training and racing as you have gotten older.
Yeah, Tony, that's a really interesting question, and it changes really drastically in each decade of your life. And I think as you get into your mid-50s, what ends up happening is you end up having fewer number of competitors, but the standard deviation or the range in terms of competitiveness is really quite high and narrow.
Right.
Because it's the folks who have decided this is not a one and done, or this is not a bucket list. This really is a lifestyle that is keeping us both fit and connected with a community
Mm-hmm.
that is inherently transgenerational.
Right.
And it was one of the best parts of triathlon, actually, is in addition to all the pieces that the article talked about in terms of the epigenetics and the ability for the body, even later in life, to reassemble proteins in a different way. I mean, this is just amazingly cool stuff. So that's the physical and biochemical side of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the family side and the community of triathlon, I would put those as equal pillars in the benefit of giving you a mindset that you can,
Mm-hmm.
you're young, and you still want to compete, and you still can compete. For me, I'll share a little bit of a sort of personal piece to the story that some listeners might find connect with their lives, and then there's one piece that is unique to my situation. I think many folks in their 30s, right? You're focused on career and family. You have young kids. You're trying to figure out, especially in academia, right? You're trying to get tenure, right? Which is a huge benchmark. You're working a lot. You don't have a lot of time to really devote to taking good care of yourself. And for me, I sort of solved a lot of those problems by commuting. So, it's base level fitness, but you get miles on your bike, and you're at least sort of in pretty decent shape. What happened to me, though, in my 40s, maybe, Tony, just a little bit before you and I met, maybe a couple of years before I met, I had a pretty big acute health crisis that involved meningitis and encephalitis. And I lost a lot of weight, became extremely weak, and ended up having to take a leave of absence from work for almost a year.
Wow.
And so this was kind of like a massive, I think I was maybe in my early 40s when this happened. It's first a wake-up call for you can't put everything on your life on the altar of work and family. And to this day, I really don't know what was the trigger and why I got these sort of terrible brain swelling diseases. But clearly, I wasn't taking good care of myself in the march up to some really big things in your life. And then sort of after I recovered from that and realized, okay, I'm grateful that I haven't lost any of my cognitive or physical abilities, which is quite common from those kinds of diseases, that I really want to change. And for me, the one thing that I thought I knew the best was running. And so I started running again. And I think I ran my first 5K maybe 15 years ago.
Right.
And, I was so proud that I ran, I don't know what it was, something like a 27-minute 5K. I was like, wow, look what I did. And, I think, that's where I started, right, on this journey to blending sort of exercise into the scholarship and work piece. But the family thing is interesting as well. So both my daughters, I have a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old daughter, they watch what you do, right? And so you are leading by example. And they both do triathlon. In fact, my older daughter is a better swimmer than I by a long shot. We are both doing Harvest Triathlon next weekend. And it's a great joy, right? Because then you're not choosing between things.
Yes.
You're doing things synergistically. And the past 3 weekends, Micah and I, my younger daughter, have been running in Cold Spring Park together. And she's thinking about maybe doing cross country. She's going to start high school in the fall. So I'm massively grateful for being able to pay it forward. And also to sort of have the influence of a coach who can sort of keep you injury free.
I'll pay you later.
Yeah. So that you can sort of, so the kids can watch you and say, hey, this is fun, right? This is part of a lifestyle that I'm curious about.
Yeah. And one of the things that you're talking about that's important for people to hear is when you do these endurance sports and as you break through 40s and 50s, and then you have a family, and you're trying to balance your training and racing with having a family. I'll often tell athletes to try to incorporate your family as much as you can, and then you're doing things like building out your home gym. You build out your home gym, whether you got your bike on a trainer, whether you get a treadmill, and that has an effect in that it allows you to cut out travel time to facilities, travel time to long rides. Cutting out that travel time really, really helps. And you've been mostly a short course athlete, but folks who are long course athletes have difficulty with this. I mean, there's actually an old joke going around social media that for some of the Ironman folks, if you make it the race week without getting separated from your spouse or your significant other, then you probably didn't train hard enough, right? So people have, I mean, it's a lot of time away from your family when you're a long course triathlete. You do an Ironman, half Ironman, and so you have to find creative ways, whether it be build out your home gym, incorporate your family, and otherwise, the people that you're with really have a challenging time being away from you when you're out going off and doing 4-hour bike rides, 5-hour bike rides, and really long training sessions. So, I mean, that's, have you seen yourself, making a lot of some of those changes in your life now that you're starting to tick up and doing a couple of longer course events?
Yeah, I think after they always say there's 4 pieces to triathlon: swim, bike, run, and nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the 5th piece is time management.
Yeah.
And certainly as I've ramped up to half Iron, I think the way I can manage it from a family perspective is they know that this is a cycle, right? And that there's a time of the year where you're going to be spending more time than others.
Right.
And that helps, right? So that it's not something that's continual. And the periodized workouts means that you're not always cranking out 8 to 12 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I think that's educating the family about the process is a way of letting them in and having some kind of sense of control over and expectations around the time that you need to be able to do this.
Right. And getting buy-in too from, getting buy-in from your family. So, I mean, you have 2 kids. I don't have a family. I'm working on that rather unsuccessfully, I might add. But you have to get, you have to get their buy-in and, sort of set the expectation and maybe even come to some, compromises, common ground about, things like, time, how much time that you're going to spend. Maybe, you carve out a day, for just them and things like that. And so you've managed to do that, to do all of this very well. And it's part of the equation as you age and continue to race, continue to train and race. And that, as we'll talk and get into the article, but as we'll see, there's some good reasons that people that are older can continue to race well within their 50s and even 60s and beyond that. So what about just for our listeners, and I'm going to ask some questions that I know, but our listeners would want to know more about this. What about you mentioned your nutrition, and talk about that, because I know that for a very long time you've been a relatively clean eater.
Yeah, it's been, for me, that part has been part of my lifestyle for probably 30 years. I was became a vegetarian sometime in the mid '80s. But vegetarians can still sort of indulge in some high fat food,
Mm-hmm.
and because of my ethnic background, I have a predisposition for some cholesterol issues. So even though I was training a lot and a vegetarian, I still was put on a statin drug for a while,
Mm-hmm.
which I had mixed feelings about, right? Because this is sort of a long-term experiment that has been started that we don't really know what longitudinal effects are, especially the issues with possible joint pain. That's something that as an athlete, you're like, is this joint pain from the statin drug or is it from my big workout? And so to eliminate that, and also in response to my older daughter's challenge, we became vegans. And I've been a vegan now for 2.5 years. And cholesterol's down, I'm off the statins, lost some weight.
All of the vegans out there are starting to applaud.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different lifestyle, right? Being a vegetarian is simple. Being a vegan is a lot more complicated. And I would say that a vegan and who's working, maybe, I guess I'm averaging maybe 6-7 hours a week or something like that in different modalities of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
I find that a lot of small meals is the way I go.
Yeah.
Constantly grazing at work. And I'm still learning about this. I think for long course and vegan, I haven't quite figured that all out yet, and I think that might be something I need to work on. For a sprint race, I think it's immaterial.
Right. Short course. I mean, but you always been, from a body composition standpoint, have always been near perfect for endurance sports from as far back as I can remember. Yeah. And so, to that end, as a short course athlete and a duathlete, you've done really well now. Yeah. And as you've indicated,
one thing I'm curious about as you age, whether people see a creep in their race weight. And I'm seeing that a little bit, and I'm not quite leaning down to what I was before.
Yeah.
My 40s.
Yeah.
And I think that
let's talk about that. Let's go into that, because we have something listed here. So, and I can even speak to a little bit of this. It's a little different with me, but as you've gotten older, as you broke through the 40s and into the 50s, do you see changes? So for me now, it's different for me now. I hardly race anything anymore. I basically, because any coach will tell you that once you start coaching, and certainly if you start running a coaching platform, you can't really train as a competitive athlete anymore, or certainly much. And so I hardly ever do anything competitively anymore. I almost universally do recreational type of events. But I can say that as I've broken into 40s, I've seen it get slightly more challenging physically and also mentally. When I was late 20s, Saturday, Sunday, I would go out and run 2 hours without even blinking an eyelash. Go out and run 2 hours or something like that, or 90 minutes or whatever. And psychologically, it just gets harder to do that. But also, I realized that it's getting slightly harder to maintain fitness that I could easily get to without even doing much. It's harder to get to that same fitness now. And it's not that you still can't get there, but it's just slightly harder. I mean, we can run off some statistics about which things drop as you get past 45. VO2 max, lactate threshold, lean body mass. These are all examples of some things that start to diminish. And one of the things that you talked about is race weight. It gets harder. It gets harder to get down to quote unquote your ideal competition weight, where you really can excel at a certain body composition. There is something to that too, in that metabolic rate can drop as you get older. But I've definitely seen some of that. And have you also seen some of that?
I have seen some of that, Tony. And I think my response to it in this past year has been, and I haven't actually explicitly said this to you, but in the quote unquote off season,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go as off as I would.
Right.
And so I think if you really take to heart an off season for recovery, then the past year, I noticed that it was going to take me like 3 months, right, before I felt like I was able to recover from off season. And so this winter, I kept a higher level of base fitness, much higher than I have in the past years. And it's been, the TSS that I can maintain right now, I'm well ahead of where I was last year. Not because I'm putting more hours in April and June, but because I've got the base from February and March.
Yeah. And that's when really one of the keys is having a full year approach, right? When you were younger, you could go through the holidays and take a couple months off and not do anything and then bounce back. But now it's getting harder to bounce back, and you sort of have to have a year round approach. I mean, even for younger folks, they say you train and race, you should have a year round approach. But it's even more important as you get older, and it just goes back to little things: building out your home gym, building out your fitness regime when the weather turns, and that's it just goes to show you how important that is. And so
I think part of it as you get older, and this is something interesting too, Tony, is that I think there's a little bit of a motivator of fear in that, is that can you get back to where you were as you get older? And the use it or lose it framework is not something when you're in your 20s or 30s you're thinking about at all, right? But there are a couple of times where I wake up in the morning and after a couple of rest days I actually feel worse than I have after I've worked my body hard. And you sort of that kind of, I don't know, I'm confessing here a little bit to that as being a driver in terms of some of the behavioral things that I choose to do.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, let's get into some of this endurance, because I think people want to hear some of this science about endurance in general. And I when I saw this article, it just jumped right out at me, just because, or this study, I should say, because I've always obviously been an advocate of endurance sports, and I think empirically there's a lot of evidence suggesting that if you had to choose something to do, endurance sports is what you would do. It really has from an opportunity cost perspective, it's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck in enhancing your fitness, whether you're an athlete, competitive, or whether you're just trying to just generally stay healthy. Endurance sports are the thing that you should do, up and above things like lifting weights and things like that. And I've said this for years, and there's sort of a little battle between the strength and conditioning personal trainer types and folks like you and I on what is the best thing to do. And I think I could demonstrate empirically that hands down, if you're an endurance athlete, you swim, bike, run, and especially into your later stages in life, you're going to get the biggest bang for buck on general fitness. And so Now, surely I'm going to probably get a lot of emails from those folks saying, trying to argue that point, but I'd welcome it. But I think we can generally demonstrate this empirically. And then you look at people like Sister Madonna Buder, right? She's the 82 years old.
Yeah.
She's the oldest woman who completed the Ironman. Lou Hollander.
Yeah, Lou.
Lou Hollander, 84, the oldest man to complete the Ironman. Ed Whitlock, who's passed away recently, 70 over 70 years of age, did a sub 3 hour marathon. And then we had Gene Dykes, who ended up breaking Ed Whitlock's record, over 70 years old, did a sub 3 hour marathon. Here some other examples here. Joan Benoit Samuelson,
just in Boston this year.
Yeah, just this year did a 3:04 marathon, and she's 62. And then I just saw just recently this guy Brad Barton, 53, did a sub 4:20 mile, and that's pretty amazing, and broke the record for that. So there's all of these examples of people. I mean, these are just isolated examples, but there's everybody knows someone who's 50 and even 60 who's really fast and continues to race, continues to do endurance sports, and I always use some of these examples when people just sort of resign that, oh, I'm getting older, I'm going to get slower. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get slower, as long as you know what to do. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree with that. I think the past few years, my times haven't gone down or up.
Exactly. They've been,
on your point of view, they've been stable, right?
Yeah.
Especially even in my 5K times. And I think part of that, right, is mixing in the right amount of track kind of workouts and interval workouts.
And then the nutrition,
that's key, right? I mean, and it's key for a lot of reasons. I think when you're doing interval workouts and track, you're doing it with a bunch of folks, and then the feeling alive and young when you're running around a track with 30-year-olds. Man, that's like, you can't put that in a bottle and sell it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think for me, being able to do high intensity interval workouts once a week, and the social setting of that has been a key reason why I've been able to stay fast.
Mm-hmm.
And
also, this, but I think it's young, male, female, young, old. I think it can be helpful to throw in some anaerobic work every week, whether it's a couple times a week, right? And even if you throw it on the end of a set, right? So anaerobic meaning really high intensity intervals, 30 seconds, 1 minute, anywhere from 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, but really high intensity. And even if it's, you throw it on 2 or 3 intervals at the end of a set with a rest in between of a minute, a couple minutes, those really have impact on you, male, female, young, old, and it's just ways to get the heart rate up. So yeah.
And that recruits a different set of muscles, and I think that's a nice segue actually into some of the things the articles talk about.
Yeah. Let's dive into this. And so and this article really, or this study, is really a PSA for not only athletes, but the average person out there that is, just looking to increase general fitness. Perhaps you haven't really gotten into endurance sports yet, thinking about running a 5K, 10K, or a triathlon or something like that. but the article or the study was in European Heart Journal, and so this idea of telomeres and explain some of what you know. And so we get your background, your science expertise on this, and explain to our listeners the premise of this study.
I can do that a little bit. Like, I'll give you some context. So, my last sabbatical I did at the Harvard School of Public Health.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the very first time where I heard from a sort of public health perspective about this field of epigenetics. And it had probably cut across the general media about 5 years ago, but largely from the perspective of neonatal and infant situations.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been known for quite a while, right? That there's a lot of plasticity to the genomic sequence when you're young.
Mm-hmm.
And this has really important implications for treating diseases. And it's a great cause for optimism, right? That you can actually, by changing behavior, cause rewiring,
right,
at the protein level, right, in terms of designing treatments. But what is a more recent development is looking at athletes across different age cohorts and seeing that there is plasticity
mm-hmm.
beyond the young.
Right.
And that essentially what happens is exercise creates a whole biochemical set of reactions that upregulates proteins that are used to essentially build some of the markers for aging. And so this article talks about that from a very sort of physical level. Like the protein piece is the very smallest fundamental building block that is linked with genetic outcomes and genetic plasticity. So this is not sort of a downstream study, but really much mechanistic, like what is actually happening, and trying to figure out that from a cellular level, which I find quite exciting.
Yeah, and seeing it, it sort of played to a little bit of my confirmation bias, because it plays into my narrative that endurance sports is the best thing to do for folks. But when I looked at the study, people always throw around studies, and you look at you dig into it, and it's like, we did a study on 5 people, these really small group samples, but looking at this one, it's not a small group. I mean, I think they ran the initial study on 160-ish people, 164 volunteers, and then they did a small follow-up study with about 15 people. And so it's this is where you look at it, you look at the results, and you say, okay, is anybody else going to corroborate these results? But initially, it's a pretty impactful study.
Yeah, I think the one thing that with these studies in general that the reader should be mindful of is how persistent are these changes post-exercise, right? And so there's a whole bunch of studies that look at right after a big VO2 max effort.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the body is doing all sorts of interesting things, right? And they look for these markers. I think it's interesting to think about, what does the baseline look like?
Mm-hmm.
How does the baseline change? This paper starts to think about that, but I think that's where the frontier is. Not doing the acute,
mm-hmm.
but looking at sort of what does a chronic base load of activity do? And what if we do that measurement 2 days after that kind of activity? those are harder to do, right? Because the measurements are more difficult to make because the deltas are smaller. But I think that's one sort of caveat that I think we need to be mindful of. And also the duration of the study.
Right.
I think it's on the order of 5 or 6 months or something like that.
Yeah.
And so for me, thinking about endurance conditioning and sort of the biochemical changes that are happening, that seems like the very earliest point at which you might expect to see some sort of systematic changes. So I'd like to see the study carried out longitudinally rather than sort of a snapshot.
Yeah.
And once we get some longitudinal studies, Tony, then I think those are sort of the real currency in these kind of investigations.
Right. And then, of course, the more it's corroborated, the more it's peer reviewed. Someone on the other on the side of the planet is going to try to corroborate these and duplicate these results. And if they can duplicate these results with bigger groups, then that's how things gradually emerge into a new emerging truth. But I definitely love the study, and I'm going to definitely post it into the show notes so that people can take a look at this study. And I'm going to definitely try to keep an eye out to see if some of their findings are corroborated. So that the main crux of the study is that telomeres are lengthened as a direct result of endurance. And they say that it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be a super marathon runner. It says that you basically have to do a couple of short light jogs 3 times a week, and that should be enough to what they think should be enough to get the effect of lengthening your telomeres. Yeah, so it's interesting. We'll keep an eye out on this. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I always wanted to ask you this because I know you have a background in geology, and we're seeing so much information out in the public sphere about recovery and what can, particularly marketed for endurance athletes. And everything is going to recover you faster and get you, injury free and even increase your performance. So you using your broad knowledge of rocks and knowing more about rocks than probably 99% of the people on Earth. Maybe, and so I'm gonna, be very objective because maybe I'm wrong on some things, but I want to get it straight from a geologist's mouth. You hear it here on the Endurance Experience. Do rocks have any type of healing properties? Meaning, can you place a rock, a crystal, on a body, any part of a body, and get it to heal that body? Is that possible?
Before I answer that question, let me back up just a tiny bit. And I think that the perspective that I bring to a question like this is it has to also consider the placebo effect.
Correct.
And so I firmly believe, and many studies have showed, that if you believe that this quartz crystal that's vibrating with a certain frequency
right.
is going to do something for you, that 30% of the time, or whatever the placebo effect is, you will see a positive outcome.
Right.
But before I dive into that question a little bit more, I want to say, I want to go on record saying that I personally don't think you can buy speed or you can buy recovery at a faster rate. I don't think these are things that are commodities that, the average triathlete has a very high income and that's problematic, actually, I think. And so you get all these people trying to sell you both speed and recovery. And I think that the science behind those things is very minimal.
Right.
Particularly on the recovery side. There's some things, obviously, from a physics and aerodynamics. Your position on the bike really matters way more than whether your bike is 16 pounds or 17 pounds. So first, I want to be on record of saying I'm not a fan of throwing cash to become faster, especially for age groupers who are averaging less than 21 miles an hour on a bike.
Right.
I mean, this is an exponential law equation, and so it doesn't really kick in until you're going faster.
Yeah. So those lighter components don't go for it if you're an age grouper.
If you're cranking out 25 miles an hour for 100 miles,
oh yeah,
folks that do that, then
those folks need every advantage at the high end, right?
Completely different. And this is one thing I just noticed recently. I have this new helmet that has dimples on it. And when I get above 35 miles an hour, I can actually hear the wind going over the helmet in a different way.
Wow.
And it's something I've never had before. And so that's kind of that's kind of cool. But the fraction of the time that I'm actually at that speed is so tiny that it's going to have no outcome, at least from a physical perspective. It might have a mental one, which you can't discount, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think you're faster because you have these $2,000 wheel sets, well, then maybe you will be faster, not necessarily because your wheels are better.
Right.
So given that sort of framework and mindset as an antecedent for answering your question, I think you can see where I'm going with this, is that as a geologist, I have a huge appreciation. And what got me into the field in the first place was looking at an outcrop of rocks, whether they be scrungy rocks that we have in Massachusetts or beautiful things like we have out west. They have the ability to evoke an emotional response if you are open to it. And for me, many times it's this combination of aesthetic beauty. And then, because of my training, I have some notion about like, oh my gosh, this was once a delta, and there once was a mountain chain here eroding, and I'm looking at this 500 million years later.
Yeah.
That's the Roxbury conglomerate, right? That's what's all around us in the Boston area. That's a cool thing. And of course, that's going to have some sort of physiological response. But that's very different than the scenario that you posed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if I had a moon rock, if they could send you to the moon or send you to Mars, that would be amazing to you, being able to pick up a rock 4.5 billion years old.
Yes.
And that would, I'd carry that around with me, and that would have an emotional response for sure. And you're right. The placebo effect is powerful, and people look at the word placebo effect. It has a negative connotation now. I even know some people who use different words, like belief response or something like that. But the reason why I wanted to ask you and get a scholar's perspective on it is many of the claims that are being made about this rocks, energy, they're being made under the guise of this is going to have phenotypic effects. It's going to have an effect on a body, on a non-placebo effect on the body, meaning they will heal bone, ligament, tendon, muscle, fascia. Which that's where I have to part from those conversations.
As far as I know, there's no epigenetic linkage between the manipulation, use, or proximity to any type of geological material,
right,
and the ability to have some sort of response like that.
Right.
In fact, the sad part of it is that some of these things actually can be dangerous.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So the reason why smoky quartz is smoky is because it's been exposed to radiation.
Right.
Right. And so those kinds of things have to be really, I get a lot of aesthetic joy out of, and my house is filled with both billion-year-old rocks and a wide range of beautiful things. But I'm not putting them on my body.
Right. Right. Exactly. So that speaks volumes to have someone like you who spent your entire life studying rocks and being an educator and a professor to be able to say that. Now let's look at the contrast where a practitioner of someone who will profess to heal someone with a rock. That look at the difference there, right? So if in fact such a thing did work, they and you don't know how that would work. That means that they would get a Nobel Prize for being able to demonstrate empirically that it would work, right? So, and that's the thing, and then and that's the whole premise of Event Horizon, and the science of self-propelled motion, and then the reason why we go with evidence-based approaches,
Exactly.
and we have an atom on our kits. This is what it's all about, and we will often hear from people with all of the manufacturers and folks that market these products. They will say, "Well, I know for a fact it works." How do you know that it works? Well, I tried it, and it worked on me, and so that is the thing that we just want to get people in the habit of understanding how what it means for something to empirically work. Now, if something is truly just a mental thing, I mean, that can have a placebo, a powerful effect. And I say, hey, have at it. Go for it. If that reduces stress hormone for you, and it makes you feel good, and you go off and like, a good example is massage. Right? So massage, I love getting massages. Yet the empirical evidence on massages is depending upon what you see is really mixed.
Yeah.
But yet I love them. I'm not going to stop doing them because
I do it once a month myself.
Yeah, it makes us feel good and everything like that. So, yeah,
I would say I would add one more piece to that line of argument and say that empiricism is important, but it's not the end point, right? You collect observations from an unbiased, controlled fashion. We call this empiricism, but it has to lead to some, and I like how you use the atom, it has to lead to some fundamental understanding of the process or the physics or the chemistry.
Exactly.
Because otherwise it's just data and noise. Exactly. And I think there's a lot of stuff that goes on in endurance sports, cutting edge things that, it's data driven, but we don't really have a theory yet to explain it. And so we should still be somewhat skeptical, right? Because we don't really understand the underlying mechanism. And, I'm one of the people who I think, paradigms have a really important role in our life. And I'd like to think that I'm someone who can recognize the paradigms and also say, hey, we've collected enough anomalies for this paradigm that maybe we got to think about a new paradigm. I think some folks don't give that cycle enough time to really work.
Right.
And I think that is part of the wanting things, quick fixes.
Yeah, and that's it. It's the silver bullet, the silver bullet fix. And I talked about this with our first podcast with Mac Brown. Everybody wants the silver bullet. Just tell me all I have to do is put this rock on me or get this, ion band or get the lighter components. Just tell me all I have to do is that, and that's the thing that's going to make me faster, injury free, and so on and so forth. And then everybody wants that silver bullet. And then as a coach, we're constantly trying to exercise that demon out of athletes about the silver bullet fix. The silver bullet really doesn't exist. The only way to get faster, stronger is with, training. And of course, recovery, really, you want to get recovered, eat well, sleep well.
Yeah.
And the only other thing that can recover you is time, So, but you've gotten you've gotten all of that down, Dan, and so we're getting up on 55-ish minutes. So let's we want to get you back to the family, and I can't wait to see what you're going to do next. So, and we'll keep trying to see if we can get you up to, dare I say, one of these days, getting you up to maybe even convince you to do one Ironman. We'll see.
I first got to get that marathon piece.
All right, we'll get that first. So if people want to look you up, I'll put your bio in the show notes. But if you have a social media presence or anything that you want to give out to folks,
yeah, I can give you. I'll send you my Twitter feed. I don't use it much, but I have my lab group has a Facebook group, and I can give you my my professional website as well.
Sweet, excellent. Well,
yeah, my professional bio has a shout out to Italian bicycles and swim, bike, and run.
I see that. We'll put it in the show notes.
It's funny, Tony, you say about the home gym. I'm sitting here on the couch, and within eyesight, I can see a bike, a treadmill, and a trainer.
There you go. There you go. That's the key.
And I'll just say one last thing, and Tony, this is your mantra, and I think especially as you get older, you really need to live by it, and that is consistency. If that's the one key to being successful in endurance as you get older, is the consistent athlete is rewarded. And life gets in the way, and I don't hit as many workouts as I want, but that's the mantra that I have in the back of my mind, and I think it's a key one.
A tear had just fallen from this coach's eye. All right.
I've learned you've learned me something there, Tony.
All right. Professor Dan Brabander, thanks for coming on the podcast.
No, you're so welcome, Tony. Thanks for all. It's been a journey, and it'll still be a journey. This is maybe just the halfway point for me. So
right.
Catch me in 10 more years.
Nice. All right, there you have it. So I will continue to follow up that study and see whether or not any scientists or research teams are able to corroborate the findings. But I think the learning is what I've always known, is that whether you're an athlete or you're just trying to get general health and fitness, endurance sports or self-propelled motion activities are the most efficient means of doing that. And as you get older, you just simply have to find smarter ways of training. And you're starting to think about changing your lifestyle, building out your home gym. All of these things are little things that you can do. Being comfortable, not going out and trying to crush everything and just doing a lot of races for fun and recreation versus, feeling like you have to PR every time you go out and race. And, finding different creative ways to get fitness. If you can't go out and run for 2 hours, maybe you run for an hour and you find more creative ways of getting fit. And so those are just a couple of takeaways. And lastly, if anyone tries to put a rock or a crystal on you to try to heal your body, I highly suggest you utilize your type 2 muscle fibers and get out of there as quickly as you can. This is the Endurance Experience.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.